Hello class, today we are going to be talking about the human body. We're going to be talking about anatomical terms for orientation as well as the body cavities. So when we talk about anatomy and physiology, we're talking about how structure underpins function. And that is a common theme in biology. When you look at ligand receptor function, you're talking about specificities eliciting some type of response, of function. And the same with proteins, for instance. Protein structure underpins function. In the same way, when we study the body, you need to study both its structure and its function because those are intimately related. So some subdivisions. There can be gross or macroscopic anatomy, so the large visible structures that we can see. And then you have regional anatomy, system anatomy, and surface anatomy as subdivisions. So regional will look at structures in a particular area. System is just focusing on one of those systems itself, which we'll talk about in more detail. And then the surface anatomy is looking at deep structures as they relate to overlying skin. So continuing these subdivisions, you also have microscopic anatomy. Histology is an important part of our class. That will be the study of tissues. You will see many histological slides. In this is also cytology, the study of cells. Cells are, of course, the basic unit of life, so they will appear heavily in the course as well. Developmental anatomy, of course, we are interested in how our physiological development occurs throughout our life, especially in the womb. So before birth, this will be embryology. And so we will be talking about aspects of development from essentially cradle to grave in this course. So we do use a sort of universal anatomical term to be able to describe to others where something is. And so continuing on with physiology. Physiology would be more the function side, so lots of biochemistry, but we're also breaking it down based on organ systems. So what function are these specialized organ systems actually carrying out? And so we're often looking at cellular and molecular levels here, lots of chemistry. And to understand that, essentially, you need to have some basic understanding of things like electrical currents, of pressure, how to describe fluids moving through a tube, essentially, but also the basic chemical principles as well. So, structure underpins function. In the same way, anatomy and physiology are inseparable. So, what a structure can do then depends on the form it takes. This is the principle of complementarity. And so, for instance, your teeth, your incisors are flat and sharpened to the point that you can cleave a carrot, for instance, whereas the molars, for instance, are flat and kind of rounded so they can grind. So structure is leading to how the function actually works. So organizational levels. You can start out at the very simplest, of course, with atoms, and even smaller than that, of course, are subatomic particles, but atoms moving up to molecules, and then finally the organelles. Organelles, little organs, are essentially these sort of functional macromolecules within the cell. Then you have the cellular level. The single cell would be the simplest form of life. Any smaller than this, and it's an acellular biological entity like a virus or a viroid or something like that. Moving up, you have tissue level. This is groups of similar cells, presumably performing some type of related function. Then at the organ level, two or more tissue types are working together to actually preserve some sort of function. At the organ system level, you have organs that are working together to do some sort of function, and then all of these things consist to make the whole organism. All organ systems combined constitute the organismal level. So you can see that here. Atoms make molecules, which make the macromolecules that make organelles. Finally, the cells, tissues, etc. So as mentioned before, cells are the basic unit of life, and cells have a number of requirements to actually meet this criteria. So for one thing, you need to be able to separate yourself from the environment. And of course, cells use a plasma membrane to do this. Many cell types actually have cell walls. Animal cells do not. But motility is often included in this. The ability to respond to stimuli. The ability to metabolize food and nutrients. The ability to get rid of waste products. The ability to reproduce and pass on your hereditary material. And the ability to grow. So separation between the internal and external environments. You need this to create the sort of differentials that are driving the metabolism necessary for life. And of course, moving up into more complex systems, you have things like the muscular system allowing for movement. It's using the skeletal muscles as basically levers and structural support. And the contractility then, even at the cellular level, would refer to that movement. So responsiveness, the ability to not only sense a stimuli, but to respond to it. So a withdrawal reflex in the case of a negative stimuli, whereas a positive stimuli would be like moving towards food. Digestion, you need to be able to break down that food once you actually obtain it. And you need to be able to break it down and absorb those simplest molecules in order to repurpose them into things that you need. We call metabolism the sum of all chemical reactions. I know colloquially we refer to it as some sort of weight loss thing. Oh, they have a fast metabolism. Well, in truth, the metabolism is all the chemical reactions that are occurring. So the sum of the catabolism and anabolism, the breakdown and the synthesis of molecules. This breakdown does produce waste products, and so you actually need to be able to remove them as well. So a great example of this is when you break down amino acids, you need to deaminate them in order to shunt them into other energy pathways. And as a result of this, you get the release of these urea products. But also carbon dioxide and feces, the food that you do not absorb. Reproduction, of course, all of this means nothing if you can't hand down your hereditary information. So at the cellular level, cells are actually reproducing, via mitosis or budding or fragmentation or something like that, binary fission. But at the organismal level, we have sexual reproduction, the production of offspring after some type of genetic recombination of it. Growth, so the ability to grow in size. Humans are multicellular, of course, so we have many different cell types to be kept alive. And to do that, we have specific organ systems that are designed to be functional service for these cells. So all cells are dependent on the organ systems to meet their survival needs, hence why we consider the organismal level to be the sum of these organ systems. There are 11 organ systems that work together to maintain life. One of them is kind of an either or. If you're a biological male, of course, you will have gonads. Your gonads will produce testosterone. If you're a biological female, they'll produce another sex hormone, estrogen. But all the organ systems are truly working together. And so the integumentary system, of course, organs would include things like the skin, hair, and nails, actually the largest by mass, but it makes up our external body covering. It lines the inside of our body cavities, and especially useful to us, provides the ciliated cells of the respiratory and digestive tract, basically to keep things moving. The skeletal system, of course, structural support. It forms the thoracic cage that protects our vital organs, and the cranial bone protecting our brain and all that. It also stores as an important reservoir for certain types of ions. And blood cell development actually begins in the bone marrow as well. So moving on to the skeletal system. The muscular system, of course, we use for motility. Also things like body language, facial movements, posture. It's also producing heat as a waste product, which is especially useful to us because we are endothermic. We have to generate our own body heat, and we do that with the muscular system. The nervous system, of course, the sort of control center of the body. This actually serves as our fast controls, as we'll see in the future. You also have a sort of slower control module with the endocrine system. Moving into the endocrine system. The endocrine system is composed of a series of glands. They are synthesizing hormones and putting them out into the bloodstream for these sort of far away targets usually. And so very important for metabolism, reproduction, and just all sorts of stuff for the breakdown and use of nutrients. The cardiovascular system, of course, the blood vessels, the vasculature itself is transporting the blood, carrying oxygen to the various tissues and removing carbon dioxide as a waste product. The heart itself is acting as a powerful pump. And so we'll look at the heart more in the future as well. Then you have the lymphatic system. There's lots of fluids in our tissues that you need to be able to drain off and reabsorb these fluids somehow. And so the lymphatic is a way to shunt this excess fluid and also to police. So this is where you will find lymphocytes kind of out there patrolling, essentially looking for any type of bacterial threat or perhaps a waste product. The respiratory system. So we need to be able to supply our blood supply with fresh oxygen, and this is how we do it. We need to be able to exchange this atmospheric oxygen with our metabolic CO2 as a waste product, and so this is what the respiratory system does. Moving on to the digestive system. So one of the requirements of life is that we have to take in nutrients. And in order to utilize it, you often have to break it down into more usable forms. And so that is the purpose of the digestive system. And again, this topic is going to come up over and over again in the class. The urinary system. So as mentioned before, our body is composed of lots of fluids. We need to be able to monitor fluid levels, not only to control our blood pressure, but also to eliminate waste, especially those nitrogenous waste products like urea from protein metabolism. Also helps in the monitoring of electrolytes. So keeping enough electrolytes in our tissues is the job of the urinary system. Okay, and so here's where we kind of split. So the first will be the male reproductive system. The overall function of which is, of course, to produce offspring. But this is also where we're starting to see our hormones that are helping to drive development of sexual secondary characteristics. The same is also true of the female reproductive system, production of offspring. The difference, of course, is that the testes are producing sperm and male sex hormones, while the female structures are serving as essentially places where fertilization can occur and the fetus can continue to develop. So moving on to survival needs, some things that we absolutely need, of course, nutrients, oxygen, water. Because we're endothermic, we need to be able to regulate our body temperature. This has to do with the optimal level that our proteins work at. If you get too hot, the proteins will start to denature, they'll deproteinate. If you get too cold, they'll slow down and won't be able to metabolize as well. Appropriate atmospheric pressure. Now this is an interesting one, but this is also a requirement for us as well. So nutrients, of course, would include the chemicals for energy and cell building. And there are really three types of macromolecules that we take in that are sort of important on the nutrient side. Of course, carbs, proteins, and fats. The missing macromolecule here is nucleic acids, but you're really synthesizing those yourself. And then they also list minerals and vitamins. So what are minerals and vitamins actually doing? Well, structurally, they are serving as support for usually an enzyme. So without the minerals and vitamins, certain enzymes just simply will not work. Oxygen, essential for the release of energy from foods. Essentially, we are using oxygen to oxidize glucose via aerobic respiration. And so we'll talk about that in more detail as well. Water, of course, the universal solvent, the most abundant chemical in our body. It depends based on sex and whatever, but 60 to 75% at any given time, base fluid for secretions and excretions. It's also helping to sort of insulate our body temp. You don't want your body temp falling below 37 degrees Celsius. At that point, you're going to be affecting metabolism. Appropriate atmospheric pressure, and this is just for the function of the lungs. Right, our lungs, you have to maintain positive and negative pressures in certain portions of them in order for the diaphragm to actually work. And so the maintenance then of this steady state is referred to as homeostasis. So we're trying to maintain stable internal conditions even though we live in a highly dynamic environment. And so you always need to adjust. And so this is actually maintained then by all the organ system. One of the ways we can do that is by constantly monitoring the types of set points that would be useful in maintaining homeostasis. And so this is done by the nervous and the endocrine systems. The things that are changing are called variables. And so examples of variables would include blood sugar, body temperature, blood volume, etc. And so all of these axes have three parts, really. The receptor, where a need is sensed, a control center, which is integrating the signal and then sending out some type of signal to an effector to try and elicit some sort of change that will adjust this variable. So receptors are monitoring the environment and essentially responding to a stimuli. And this can be a range of things, but typically a receptor has a very specific ligand, which is just a chemical component that it would work with. But you also have things like baroreceptors that are sensing changes in pressure, mechanoreceptors that are sensing stretch, things like that. The control center, of course, is monitoring this base set point. This is the level that you want the variable at. It receives input from the receptor that something has changed and we are deviating from that set point, and now it's going to determine how to respond to that. And it responds to that by sending an output to the effector. The effector provides you the means to respond. And so there are two outcomes here. You can reduce the stimulus with negative feedback or enhance the stimulus with positive feedback. Now, we're going to see lots of instances of negative feedback in the endocrine system. However, positive feedback is a little rarer. So negative feedback, of course, the most used. It is what is used at the hypothalamal axis to control tons of different hormones. And essentially what's happening is the endpoint of a chemical pathway is acting to inhibit the first step of that pathway. And so what's happening is you are regulating that response. And so a lot of stuff works like this. The regulation of body temperature, for instance, the regulation of blood glucose, many different hormones as well. So very common mechanism. So more examples, the pancreas, of course, secreting insulin into the blood when it senses a change in blood sugar. It will cause the body cells, the effectors in this case, to absorb more glucose, thus decreasing blood glucose levels. So what about positive feedback? Well, as I mentioned, this is a little bit rarer, but it is essentially adding on to a signal. It is enhancing, exaggerating that original stimulus. One way it can do that is by exhibiting a cascade or an amplifying effect. And a couple of examples would be the platelet formation of the plug and essentially blood clotting. What it's doing is pulling in more platelets to actually continue to build the plug. And labor contractions actually work like this, where oxytocin will continue to increase the duration and force of those contractions in a positive feedback loop. So here's that platelet plug formation. That. So any type of imbalance in homeostasis is going to have big consequences. Increasing your risk for disease, increasing how well you age, your quality of life after you age. And some of these mechanisms, if they continue, can lead to disastrous failure. So moving into part B, we're going to talk about orientation in anatomical terms. So in order to be able to communicate with other anatomy and physiology practitioners, we had to determine a standard position. And so standard anatomical position, the body is erect, the feet are slightly apart, your palms are facing forward, your thumbs are pointing away. And so we have a lot of directional terms to describe this, but they will always be based on that anatomical position. And this can be kind of confusing, but when we say right and left in anatomy and physiology, we're talking about the subject. We are not talking about our right and left. So don't get thrown off by that. So let's go over some of these terms. Usually you'll see some of these terms have two ways to describe them. I tend to use usually the first term rather than a body term, but that is more because I work with other animals that these would not necessarily apply to. So if something is superior relative to something else, then it is toward the head or above. And so we would say that the head is superior to the abdomen. That can also be called cranial, but again, not all animals have cephalization. So, use this term for people if you would like. On the other hand, inferior would be away from the head in, towards the lower part, or even below something. So we would say that the navel is inferior to the chin in this instance. If something is anterior, it's towards the front of the body. If something is posterior, it's towards the back of the body. And so this also means in front of and behind. So we would say that the breastbone is anterior to the spine, while the heart is posterior to the breastbone. If something is medial, it is towards the midline. If something is lateral, it's away from that midline. And if it's something intermediate, it's somewhere between your medial and lateral lines. So if something is proximal, it is closer to the point of attachment. If something is distal, it is further from the point of attachment. So we would say perhaps that the wrist is distal compared relative to the elbow to the shoulder. And the elbow is proximal to the wrist. If it's superficial, it will be external, so towards the body surface. If it's deep, it is internal, away from the body surface, more internal. Moving on to our regional terms. This will come up a lot when we talk about the skeletal systems and the muscular systems, but there are two major divisions, the axial and appendicular skeleton. And so the axial includes the head, neck, and trunk, while the appendicular is everything that appends to that. So limbs and including the pelvis. And so these are designating specific terms within the body region. So you've got cephalic towards the head, cervical towards the neck, thoracic, abdominal, pelvic, pubic, upper limb, then manus, lower limb, and just continuing on with these terms. And of course, there will be a posterior view of that as well. So body planes and sections. So when we make cuts, we need to be able to describe how the cut was actually made. And so for that, we have different terms to describe where along the body plane such a cut was made. And so the sagittal plane is cutting along the midline vertically into right and left parts. So if it's mid-sagittal, it is perfectly on the midline. If it's parasagittal, then it is off-centered laterally. A frontal or coronal plane. will divide the body into the anterior and posterior parts, so front and back. We call that a coronal section. A transverse or horizontal plane will divide the body 90 degrees vertical to that plane into its superior and inferior parts, so top and bottom. That is what is called a cross section. If you have any other angle than that 90 degrees, then you have an oblique section. And so we take these different scans and different sections in order to see different aspects of your internal anatomy. So here's some MRI images. Okay, moving on to body cavities and their membranes. So in order to maintain our homeostatic conditions, we need to be able to close ourselves off from the environment. And we also need to protect our very soft and squishy organs within. And so there are two body cavities that are helping to do this. They're providing sort of an enclosed environment for our organs, the dorsal and ventral body cavities. So the dorsal body cavity, which would be more towards the back, is going to protect the fragile nervous system. And so think of the dorsal fin of a shark, right? The fin is on the back. These cavities are towards the posterior side of the body. You have two divisions, the cranial cavity, which is protecting the brain, and the vertebral cavity, which is protecting the spinal cord. And so these are the elements of the nervous system. And there are various subdivisions that we will get more into in the future. But moving on to the ventral body cavity, so think of the ventral fin of some ray-finned fishes. They are towards the sort of anterior portion. So houses the internal organs. We call those viscera. That is sort of all the organs that are in there. And there are two subdivisions there separated by the diaphragm. So in the superior part, you have the thoracic cavity. In the inferior part, you have the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the thoracic cavity itself has several subdivisions. There are the two pleural cavities that surround the lungs, and then the space in between them is the mediastinum. And so the mediastinum actually has the pericardial cavity, which has the heart, and not only that, but the thoracic organs like our esophagus, our trachea, those are passing through the mediastinum. And of course, the pericardial cavity is enclosing the heart. So moving down into the inferior portion, you have the abdominal pelvic cavity, which, as the name implies, has two divisions, abdominal and pelvic. The abdominal cavity contains our stomach, our intestines, our spleen, and our liver. While moving down even further down into sort of that pelvic girdle, you've got the urinary bladder, the reproductive organs, as well as the rectum. So we want all of our organs staying in the right place, and there are various membranes in between to sort of help insulate and hold the organs there, but sometimes stuff gets out of whack. And so the example they give is the hiatal hernia, where the stomach protrudes through the diaphragm, so going from the abdominal cavity up into the thoracic, and it can push stomach acid into the esophagus, leading to heartburn. If it gets severe enough, you will have to have your esophagus repaired. But as mentioned, these cavities are lined with membranes, and the membranes have multiple purposes. They are lubricated to help prevent friction, and they're also helping to hold the organs in place. For instance, the kidneys being retroperitoneal, they're sort of held onto that wall there. They are double layered, including a parietal layer, which is lining the internal body, and then a visceral layer. Visceral, of course, being associated with the organ. It's actually covering that internal organ. In between these two layers is a cavity filled with serous fluid. And the fluid is actually secreted by both sides, and all it really does is prevent friction, right? You wouldn't want internal organs rubbing on each other. So those membranes are named for where they are associated. For instance, the pericardium is around the heart, the pleurae in the lungs, and the peritoneum in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So sometimes these membranes do get infections in them, and as a result of that, these smooth layers that are usually well lubricated can become quite rough and even begin to stick together. And you do feel this, even though these organs are not necessarily full of pain receptors, you will have some referred pain. And examples of this include pleurisy and peritonitis. So we have ways of describing these quadrants and regions just in order to communicate where something is located. And so this is used by medical personnel. And so for the abdominal pelvic region, you have quarters. So a right upper, left upper, right lower, and left lower. So we'll look at an example of that. And you can see that deep to these quadrants, there are certain organs located there. And so if a patient is reporting symptoms in one of these quadrants, you can easily sort of narrow it down as to which organ is actually responsible. So continuing on with the regions. So a quadrant, quad 4, regions break it down even more. And so we're breaking it down into a tic-tac-toe grid with 9 anatomical regions. You have the right hypochondriac, the epigastric, the left hypochondriac. These are all sort of the superior. Then you have the right lumbar, umbilical, left lumbar. This is sort of the medial regions. Then the right iliac, the hypogastric, and the left iliac. And so those are kind of named for the deep structures there. Iliac is going to be associated with the pelvis. Lumbar is going to be associated with the spinal region, etc. And then, of course, you have the pubic, the umbilical, where your navel is, and the epigastric. Epi means upon, so it's kind of above that gastric region. So there are some other body cavities, some that have miscellaneous functions as well. These are outside the 2 main body cavities. But of course, these would include the oral and digestive cavities, so the mouth, the nasal cavity, which is helping to humidify and filter air, the orbital cavities, which house our eyes, the middle ear cavities, which house the machinery for us to interpret sound waves, and then your joints actually have cavities in them as well, the synovial cavities, which are filled with a synovial fluid. So that was the human body plan, orientation, and anatomical positions. Thank you. Have a good day.